Good morning, everybody. I hope you are all doing well, and welcome back for section 8.4, which is going to be about the new movements in both China and Japan in the interwar period. Also, this, of course, is one of the first sections that really directly sets us up for World War II. Last time we were talking about China and, China specifically, we'll start with China. We were talking about the Qing dynasty, who, of course, was defeated in the Opium Wars by the British Empire and basically forced into a horrible situation where they didn't really run their own country. Now, things, of course, there didn't get any better. They, in fact, got worse. In 1908, China got a new emperor, and, of course, he is the last Qing emperor. His name is Puyi. And we're looking at him here. The day that he became the Emperor of China, he was 2 years and 10 months old. So, not usually a good thing. We've seen over the course of our class, not usually a good thing to have a child running your country, because it leaves a power vacuum that pretty much everybody wants to fill. And pretty rapidly that happened in China. On February 12th of 1912, so only 4 years later, he was forced to abdicate power, and the power then went to a guy that we did talk about before, whose name was Sun Yat-sen, who really represented the modernization of China. On the left there, we can see Sun Yat-sen, who was the first president of the Republic of China. He's the guy who originally was pushing the ideas that we called the three principles of the people, which were nationalism, democracy, and livelihood or economic security. However, also in 1912, he didn't even last an entire year. He was forced to step down by one of China's generals, which is General Yuan Shikai, who's on the right-hand side there. Yuan really tried to establish a new imperial dynasty under his family, but ultimately from 1912 until 1916, he did set up basically a new empire. However, he wasn't strong enough to hold it together, and so in 1916, when he died, the country collapsed, and in different sections of China, what we saw was different warlords took over, and we sometimes refer to this as the 20th century warlord period, from 1916 all the way into the 1920s. Now, really, nobody was happy with this. The conservatives were unhappy because things were changing. Liberals were unhappy because people didn't have rights. Socialists were unhappy because, of course, they're socialists and they're always unhappy. Nationalists were unhappy because China wasn't China anymore. It was divided up into multiple different warlord sections, and really there was no unification of any kind. And we still have all this outside interference in China, and other countries, especially Japan, are getting involved in messing with what's going on in their country. And so, again, everybody's really unhappy during this warlord period. Now, in 1919, on May the 4th, a group of college students started what was called the May the 4th movement in the city of Beijing, which, of course, is the capital of China. This May the 4th movement was designed for two things. Number one, it was designed to protest the fact that the Japanese Empire was getting more and more dominant over China, and also the fact that they had been losing control. This May the 4th group of students was really looking at trying to do in China what the Meiji Restoration had done in Japan. They want to modernize, they want to update. The problem, though, is that this particular group of students decides that the most modern thing they can think of, the best thing they can do for their country, is to start to make radical changes towards Marxism and towards communism specifically. They're going to start going to the Soviet Union to get trained on how to become the leaders of the Communist Party, to how to start a proletariat revolution, a workers' revolution, how to create, class unity, and how to take from the rich and give to the poor and create absolute total equality of outcome. The May the 4th movement really produces the early Communist Party of China. Now, the problem is, of course, not everybody's really super happy with that. Sun Yat-sen had also now established his own political party, which was called the Kuomintang, and he ran that as basically a new liberal and, more importantly, nationalist party. His right-hand man, which we can see here on the right-hand side, was a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, who became the new party leader after 1925 and really established that the Kuomintang was the party of nationalism. after the death of Sun Yat-sen. Now, the problem, though, is that as a nationalist, one of the things that Chiang Kai-shek really couldn't tolerate all that much was communism. However, he did decide that communists were useful in getting the lower class people organized and encouraged to fight to unify the country together against the warlords. And so Chiang Kai-shek took a position where he made an alliance with the leader of the Communist Party, whose name was Mao Zedong. And basically the two of them started to work towards unifying China together and taking it back from the warlords, and they were actually finding quite a lot of success in that. However, Chiang Kai-shek was worried that he was going to have to share power with communists, and he didn't like communism. So in April of 1927, Chiang Kai-shek turned around and double-crossed the communist allies and ultimately started a campaign to try to remove communism from China. Now, unlike Lenin in the Soviet Union, and definitely unlike Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao changes what communism means, and he really doesn't focus on the industrial factory labor to create the revolution. Because, of course, China doesn't have a great deal of that anyhow, at least not at the time. Of course, we know it's different now, but in the 20s, China didn't have a huge industrial capacity, and so they didn't have a lot of industrial workers. So Mao and Maoism is a form of communism that focuses more specifically on rural peasants. And as a result of that, it makes Maoism very popular to rural peasants, and he develops a large following, especially in the countryside. However, when Chiang Kai-shek turns around and attacks the communists, of course, what this leads to is the Chinese Civil War, wherein we've got the nationalists versus the communists. Now, of course, you've got the nationalists who control most of the military versus the communists who are the leaders of the incredibly poor rural farmers. And of course, at the beginning, it doesn't go well. So here we see, of course, Mao Zedong and some of his men escaping and running away. And really what we call this is the Long March. During the Long March, the communists are forced to flee. They're trying to get towards the Soviet Union. In 1934 and 1935, things are just not going well, and it looks like the Kuomintang is going to win the Chinese Civil War, and they're really going to, put the smackdown on the communists in China, and that the Chinese communism is going to be a complete and total failure. However, we have to add another piece to the story before we can really understand why the Chinese Civil War comes out the way that it does. And the big factor in this Chinese Civil War was, in fact, Japan. In Japan in 1926, we got a pretty big shift, and what we got was a new emperor whose name was Hirohito. Hirohito took control of Japan in 1926 just as Japan was doing just about as well as they were ever going to do. All of those Meiji Restoration changes were really finally starting to pay off. The economy was doing incredible. Politically, they were extending rights to basically everybody. In 1925, all Japanese men could vote, no matter their age, no matter what was going on in their life. So we go from a Japan with a strict and rigid social caste system to a Japan that has universal male suffrage in 1925, which is pretty darn amazing. It was one of the most positive and forward-thinking and prosperous democratic countries in the entire world when Hirohito took it over in 1926. The problem, of course, was we got two things that happened basically together. One of them was the Tokyo earthquake. This was somewhere around a magnitude 8 earthquake. It destroyed the city of Tokyo. It destroyed a lot of what was going on, a lot of the positive things, a lot of the factories, a lot of the new in Japan was obliterated, and people really got scared of what was going on around them, and they really got to the point where they felt as though they wanted someone to protect them and someone to save them. And what we see is the rise of a new party, a political party that we call the ultranationalist party in Japan. And these people have a very simple message for the people of Japan. If you give us power, we will use it to make you safe and secure and prosperous forever. All we need from you is power. And unfortunately, of course, the Tokyo earthquake made people afraid enough that the ultranationalists started to get some political pull. And then things got worse. In 1929, we see the start of the Great Depression, which is a worldwide Great Depression where the economies of the entire world went extremely bad. People lost their jobs. Industrial production slowed way down. Huge unemployment. The growth that you can see. Japan was doing really well. Basically, from 1910 to 1929, the economy had doubled, which is amazing. I mean, that's a humongous amount of growth. 1929 hits. Investment dries up, businesses close, we see this huge stagnation, and during that first part of the 1930s, you can see the tremendous collapse in the Japanese economy. And of course, what people wanted was Superman, right? They wanted someone to come and save them, and the ultranationalists said, give us the power, and we will make you safe forever. And of course, at the time, in the middle of the Great Depression, that was a very appealing kind of a message. So people started to vote for ultranationalists. Now, what the ultranationalists decided to do is, we're going to do whatever it takes in order to make Japan safe and strong and prosperous. And so whatever it takes, that's the key idea here, because they're willing to do pretty much whatever it takes for Japan to win. In 1931, Japan under the ultranationalists decide that what they need is more industrial growth, and to get that, they need more resources, natural resources, raw materials in particular. And so in 1931, the Japanese start the invasion of a region in China called Manchuria. Now, to be fair, this realistically should be considered to be the beginning of the Second World War, because eventually it's going to help to lead us into the Second World War. But ultimately, in 1931, the invasion of Manchuria starts what we call the Second Sino-Japanese War. When Japan invades Manchuria, since Manchuria is part of China, the Chinese, of course, are in a really bad situation, because we know that the communists and the nationalists have been fighting a civil war against each other for several years. And so the Japanese take advantage of this and decide, we're going to invade Manchuria, get more resources, make Japan safe and prosperous, and everybody's going to be happy except for the Chinese. But of course, the ultranationalists don't care about the Chinese. The Chinese decide in 1931 that since Japan invaded Manchuria, we're going to team up. So on the left-hand side of this photograph, we see Mao Zedong. On the right-hand side, we see Chiang Kai-shek. They united together to form what is called the Second Unified Front. And the Second Front is formed specifically to remove the Japanese from China. And so they kind of put the Civil War on hold, as it was, and they said, we're going to stop fighting each other for now so that we can fight the Japanese and take back our homeland. The real problem from this comes from the fact that, however, this war is mostly going to happen in areas that had been under the control of the nationalists. So the nationalists are going to get really pounded by the Japanese, while the communists aren't obliterated during the Civil War, and they're allowed to really bounce back. This, however, then the situation kind of stays in that situation with the unified front of the Chinese, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, fighting the Japanese, all the way up until we see the Japanese advance again into the rest of China. In this particular situation, they decide that they're going to just continue their advance, they're going to continue their invasion, and basically they're going to be brutal and awful and do whatever it is that needs to be done. And this brutal treatment is something that the Chinese still definitely remember. They are still very angry about what the Japanese did to China in this invasion. And of course, the ultranationalists were in a position where they wanted to show people back home just how serious and committed they were to making Japan strong. And so we see a couple of really horrific events here. One of them is called the Rape of Nanjing. When the Japanese army invaded the city of Nanjing, they absolutely brutalized it. We have stories of just massive lawlessness. The Japanese army gets completely and totally out of control. They start targeting civilians. There are whole campaigns of systematic rape against people in the city of Nanjing. There are murders. The ultranationalists themselves actually document this in 1937 when they begin the length of the Rape of Nanjing. It starts off with a siege of the city. They go into hospitals to execute people. I mean, it really is just horrible, horrible, awful stuff. Now, in the middle of this, one of the things we see, and one of the most famous photographs to come out of this particular Rape of Nanjing event, was people who were scared decided to run to the middle of the city because there was a train station there, and they thought if they got onto the trains, they could get away and escape from the army so that they weren't going to be brutalized. When the Japanese found out about the civilians running to the train station, they decided to firebomb that train station. When they firebombed that train, now a firebomb, just to kind of clarify that for you a little bit, a firebomb is different than a regular bomb. A regular bomb blows up and it causes devastation and damage through pressure. A firebomb blows up and then burns. So generally what you have is an explosion with gasoline, so that ultimately that gasoline or whatever the incendiary is going to burn at a really, really hot temperature. The Japanese firebombed that train station in the middle of Nanjing specifically to target a lot of the innocent civilians that were there. When they arrived, one of the most famous photographs of this particular event is this one, which shows an infant who is still on fire when the Japanese show up. They took this photograph in order to demonstrate to the people back home that, hey, by the way, this is what we're willing to do to make you safe. Right? This again, it's a horrific thing. It really shows what the Japanese ultranationalists were willing to do in order to make their country more prosperous and more safe, but it also shows why the Chinese are still really, really angry at them. The next idea that the Japanese have is we don't want a lot of Chinese children growing up being angry at us and eventually being an army that's going to kill us one day, and so they start infanticides where they'll go into prenatal hospitals and they'll start murdering children. They execute people all the time. They called the city council of Nanjing together at City Hall for a meeting where they were going to allow them to formally surrender. The people showed up to this meeting, and then nobody saw the city council for a while until they went to City Hall, and what they found left behind, of course, was the severed heads of their City Hall officials. And so, again, it's horrible, brutal, awful treatment. It's exactly what the Japanese ultranationalists were all about. It's what they promised people they were going to do. And of course, it continues all the way through the 1930s and then into the 1940s, where we see the Japanese Empire continues to invade Japan. The Japanese Empire continues to invade China. Eventually, they're going to continue to push down into French Indochina and Burma, where they get involved in wars against the French Empire and the British Empire, and they continue to expand further and further and further until eventually in 1939, the United States took action, and we decided that we were no longer going to trade important military products with the Empire of Japan. We were no longer going to sell them aluminum and steel and oil and airplane parts and things like that. And ultimately then the problem becomes the Japanese look at that action, they say the Americans now are making us weaker. And so we want to see if we can figure out as the Japanese Empire how to get them to trade with us again. And of course, most of you understand that that's what's going to eventually lead us into the Pearl Harbor attack. And we'll leave that for topic 9, which of course is World War II. So I hope this video was useful to you. I hope you guys understand what's going on in China and Japan in the interwar period. With the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the West after the First World War. We're going to look at how things develop in the 1920s. We're going to start looking at the Depression. And then, of course, coming up, what we've got is the rise of totalitarianism, which, again, all of the next 4 units is about setting us up for World War II, which is topic 9. So everybody stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.